Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the third and final mini-lecture on Philip Pullman's novel, The Amber Spyglass. This is the final mini-lecture of the semester, and so appropriately enough, our topic for this final talk is Tell Them Stories. Lyra, you recall, is proud of her fluency as a liar. Early in The Subtle Knife, fighting with Will, she had declared, "You think I don't know about lying and all that? I'm the best liar there ever was." Lyra calls on this talent in Chapter 19 of The Amber Spyglass. Sitting down to a meal with a recently deceased family, the children are asked where they come from. "I'll tell you all about it," said Lyra. As she said that, as she took charge, part of her felt a little stream of pleasure rising upward in her chest like the bubbles in champagne. And she knew Will was watching, and she was happy that he could see her doing what she was best at, doing it for him and for all of them. She started by telling about her parents. They were a duke and duchess, very important and wealthy. The story she invents gets more and more extravagant, but the narrator tells us the people ate up this nonsense with placid credulity. It doesn't go so well with the Harpies. In Chapter 21, Lyra offers to tell them a story as the price of admission to the realm of the dead. She launches into an update of the tale she had spun the night before, but has barely begun when the Harpy No-Name attacks, tearing out a clump of Lyra's hair, screaming, "Liar! Liar!" Lyra is shaken and baffled by this failure. "It's all I can do," she tells Will, "and it doesn't work." The world of the dead in Pullman is modeled on an episode in Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus and his men sail to the shores of Cimmeria to summon the spirits of the dead. "I took the sheep and cut their throats over the pit, and the dark blood ran forth. Then there gathered from out of Erebus the spirits of those that are dead, brides and unwedded youths, and toil-worn old men, and tender maidens with hearts yet new to sorrow, and many, too, that had been wounded with bronze-tipped spears, men slain in fights, wearing their blood-stained armor. These came thronging in crowds about the pit from every side, with a wondrous cry, and pale fear seized me." The blood is what attracts the ghosts. As the shade of Tiresias explains, "Whomsoever that are dead and gone, thou shalt suffer to draw near the blood. He will tell thee sooth." So too, in Pullman's underworld, the ghosts were fascinated by the blood on Lyra's forehead. It glowed as brightly as a holly berry in the dimness, and several of them had brushed through it, longing for the contact with something so vibrantly alive. The ghosts themselves have as much substance as fog, and their world is featureless, a vast plain lit by a dull self-luminescence that seemed to exist everywhere equally, so that there were no true shadows and no true light, and everything was the same dingy color. This featureless and insubstantial world is also without incident or event, a sad parody of eternity. "I don't know what's going to happen ever again." "There ain't nothing gonna happen," someone else said. "Nothing forever." What happens is Lyra's storytelling. The ghost children have forgotten their names, their lives, everything but the feel of sunshine and wind. They beg Lyra to tell them about the things they remembered, the sun and the wind and the sky, and the things they'd forgotten, such as how to play. And Lyra began to talk about the world she knew. True, richly detailed stories about her childhood in Oxford. As she spoke, playing on all their senses, the ghosts crowded closer, feeding on her words, remembering the time when they had flesh and skin and nerves and senses, and willing her never to stop. The ghosts feeding on her words are like the ghosts in Homer who speak after they drink the blood of sacrifice. They also recall the people in the shanty town who shared their meal with Lyra and her friends and ate up the nonsense of her lies. If stories are food, they got the worst of the exchange. Even the harpies draw near to listen as Lyra talks about Oxford. Their leader explains why they are mesmerized.
"Because it was true," said No Name. "Because she spoke the truth. Because it was nourishing. Because it was feeding us."
Forgetting is what drains the underworld of detail. When Lyra and her companions first arrive in the world of the dead, they notice that the color was slowly seeping out of the world. And they conclude that the landscape is fading because these people are forgetting it. Remembering is what finally liberates the ghosts. Tialys and the Lady Salmakia broker a deal, a narrative contract, with the harpies, who are given a new task, conducting the dead souls from their landing place to a new opening back into the world in return for stories about their lives. As I mentioned in the first lecture, this series of scenes in the underworld is broken up by Mary's ascent into the canopy of the wheelpod trees. The contrasts are brilliant: depth and altitude, darkness and light, stale air and fresh breeze, blankness and fog, against a vista of blue sea and golden brown prairie, and most important of all, infinite sadness against something very different. As she lay in the fork of the great branches, she felt a kind of bliss she had only felt once before, and that was not when she made her vows as a nun. The connection between this moment and Lyra's storytelling is only implied, but it returns in chapter 27 when Mary raises a platform into the canopy so that she can better observe the flow of dust. On the comfort of the platform, she finds herself slipping into a trance-like state. The drift was mesmerizing. How easy it would be to fall into a trance and let her mind drift away with the floating particles. Before she knew what she was doing, and because her body was lulled, that was exactly what happened. She suddenly snapped awake to find herself outside her body, and she panicked. Because her body was lulled. This moment of awakening to danger lends new significance to a detail you might not have noticed in the first ascent, when Mary experiences bodily bliss rather than this out-of-body trance. Eventually, she was brought back to her normal state of mind by a cramp in her right ankle. The reality of sense experience, anchored in the body, was what awakened Mary in the first scene, and it is what saves her in this one. She flung a mental lifeline to that physical self and tried to recall the feeling of being in it, all the sensations that made up being alive, the exact touch of her friend Atal's soft-tipped trunk caressing her neck, the taste of bacon and eggs, the triumphant strain in her muscles as she pulled herself up a rock face, the delicate dancing of her fingers on a computer keyboard, the smell of roasting coffee, the warmth of her bed on a winter night. This act of willed remembering brings the parallel with the underworld into focus. Slipping into the trance is like the forgetting of worldly experience by the dead souls as the landscape about them fades into dim, featureless mist. And remembering is like Lyra's storytelling, rich with taste, touch, smell, and muscle memory. Storytelling is also like eating, a form of nourishment, and it is like the blood the ghosts crave to touch and taste. We will learn later what is only suggested in this scene, that the current of dust which almost carries Mary away is faster and stronger because it is flowing into the abyss opened up by the explosion meant to kill Lyra. The force that carried her out was as smooth and powerful as water rushing over a weir. The particles of dust were streaming along as if they, too, were pouring over some invisible edge. This scene is parallel to Lyra's narrow escape from the abyss in the previous chapter. And it seemed to happen so slowly, but there was nothing she could do. Her weight shifted, the stones moved under her feet, and helplessly she began to slide. And just as Mary is saved by memories of bodily sensation, what saves Lyra here is her own storytelling, what I called the narrative contract with the Harpies, their willingness to accept a new task and be paid in stories they can feed on, appears in the person of No Name to clutch Lyra just as she slides over the edge. When the ghosts re-enter the world, they dissolve in a bliss not unlike Mary's, a positive version of her near-death experience in the canopy. The first ghost to leave the world of the dead was Roger. He took a step forward and turned back to look at Lyra and laughed in surprise as he found himself turning into the night, the starlight, the air. And then he was gone, leaving behind such a vivid little burst of happiness that Will was reminded of bubbles in a glass of champagne. Those bubbles in the champagne glass are familiar. Remember Lyra back in the suburbs of the dead, reveling in the fluency of her lies? Part of her felt a little stream of pleasure rising upward in her chest like the bubbles in champagne. The return of that image and the blissful dissolution of the ghosts as they rejoin the world identifies Roger's vivid little burst of happiness as the authentic version of that little stream of pleasure Lyra gets from lying. Both of these pleasures are linked to the erotic bliss Mary felt in the canopy. The lines of action in the world of the dead and the Malefa world converge when Will creates an opening between them, releasing the ghosts from their prison, and again when he opens a window at the end of the great battle so that he and Lyra can escape back into Pullman's version of paradise. Mary wanders out into the night and is astonished to witness the procession of ghosts exiting the underworld, their faces transformed with joy. Mary had never seen such joy, and held out their arms as if they were embracing the whole universe. One of the ghosts beckons to Mary and whispers to her, "Tell them stories. They need the truth. You must tell them true stories, and everything will be well. Just tell them stories." This is a pivotal moment because the old woman who speaks these words is referring to the Harpies and their narrative contract. Tell them stories and they will lead you to bliss. The dust is disappearing faster than ever, and Atal asks her, "What can you do?" Mary felt the weight of responsibility like a heavy hand between her shoulder blades, but made herself sit up lightly. "Tell them stories," she said. In class, we can talk about the story Mary tells and how it completes the parallel that links feeding and storytelling to erotic bliss in one final version of the rescue from the abyss moment that both Lyra and Mary experience.